So quickly, just introductions. Myself, I'm Tim Middlehurst. I work for Certified Energy. We are a provider of energy certification services in New Zealand. Our purpose effectively is to support production of renewable energy and to facilitate the maximum value for producers of renewable energy. We've operated the NZECS for a number of years now, the electricity certification system, and we're very excited to be able to play a role in supporting the growth in renewable gas in New Zealand. Ian, do you want to say a few words?
Sure, Tim. So I'm Ian Dempster. I'm helping Tim with this process. Some of you will know me from my time at GIC. Prior to that, I had various involvements in the energy sector. If you go back to when people were riding dinosaurs, I used to do long-term power system planning. Spent a bit of time in investment banking where I did mergers and acquisitions and a bit of strategic advice on energy acquisitions and planning. So I've been around a while and I've got the grey hairs to prove it.
Really quickly running through the process of consultation, then we have published a discussion paper. The discussion paper contains a number of concepts that we see as important to implement into the certification system. Fundamentally, the gas certification system that we're proposing is intended to bring a whole range of international certification concepts, both for gas and other energy carriers, and then ground that in the New Zealand gas industry in terms of our history, our current and our aspirations. And so the consultation process is really important for us to learn a bit more about what participants may wish to do within the constraints of energy certification, and so therefore make sure that we understand the priorities for the system and how best to support that activity. All input is welcome. Feel free to comment on the discussion paper, any of the topics, plus anything that's not contained within it. Really keen to seek feedback. We will be summarising and responding to the feedback we received through this initial process, and we'll be publishing a document summarising those responses prior to the release of the draft rules. Really quickly, we need feedback on the discussion paper before the start of day on the 23rd of May, which gives us a little bit of time still, and then we'll be aiming to have the draft rules out early July and the initial rules published early August. So a condensed consultation time frame, but a key point to stress here is that we don't see this initial publication as being final, but rather it's a starting point for us to develop a functional certification system in collaboration with the industry going forward. Ian, did you want to run us through the definition of renewable gas?
Yeah, sure. Okay, renewable gas. Well, we basically say what it is on that first line. Gas which has got wholly renewable production inputs. So obviously, you know, biomass as a general situation is renewable. But I guess we're particularly interested in biomass that isn't competing with, you know, food sources and things like that. You don't want to get into sort of ethical issues. The other thing is those gases which don't cause the emission of carbon dioxide in their production are of particular interest as well. And you know, hydrogen or green hydrogen is a classic example of that. And I guess that brings us to the two obvious renewable gases that are around at the moment. And that's biomethane that's been derived from biogas. And if you think about what biogas is, something that comes from an anaerobic digestion process, that in its raw state will be a mix of methane, water, carbon dioxide, and some other impurities that may be things like hydrogen sulfide and so on. In order to upgrade that to biomethane, you need to strip out the water and at least most of the CO2. You definitely want to get rid of things like sulfur, so hydrogen sulfide, you want to get rid of that. And you want to essentially process it so that it meets the natural gas specification standard, and then it's able to be injected into pipelines. Hydrogen from renewable sources is obviously a really good option. And in fact, you can blend hydrogen directly into the natural gas stream without obviously destroying that, the adherence to spec, which is good. Yeah, so those are the ones that are kind of around now or just coming over the horizon. But there are other technologies that are either being researched or being developed. And obviously, as those come to market, we should obviously include those in the things that are able to be certified. Tim, back to you.
Thank you, Ian. So I just wanted to talk quite briefly around a number of the design elements of the system. These are things that we see as important in order to provide the function of attribute certification and transfer. So I'll run through a couple of points here really quickly, and then if you have any questions around these, of course, please ask or let us know if you want to pause. From the top, the concept of book and claim effectively is an aspect of certification that we see as very useful. It enables us to track a particular attribute and claim ownership to that via digital transfer. In that claiming process, it's really important that those claims are only made in one place. And so as a concept of certification, a claim must be unique, it must be verifiable to as unique in itself. One of the reasons that we therefore require the reporting entity to be involved is so that all parties involved in that attribute transfer know what's going on effectively and have clarity around their own emissions characteristics, if that is the attribute of interest. We do all of this within a particular time period, and the initial time period proposed is a 12-month production year. The timing of that production year, as proposed in the discussion paper, is to align with the New Zealand gas year. And the concept of time period matching is, as opposed to an unended time period which allows stockpiling, requiring things to match within a particular time period enables balancing and reconciliation. So we can still hold together concepts of consumption volumes and production volumes, and within that time period we can apportion ownership of all of the attributes that took place within that production. So we'll talk about it a bit more, of course, but what's really important for us is that we can enable every energy user to understand what the attributes of their energy type was, both those who are engaging explicitly in the purchase of a certificate and those who are receiving the residual supply. Along the same lines of logic, it's sensible for us to have a clear boundary around the area which we enable attribute transfer to take place. So the electricity certification system currently uses the geographical boundary of New Zealand. We have the same need to define a boundary for the gas system. There is, of course, ability to transfer attributes between on-grid and off-grid, pipeline connected and non-pipeline connected production projects. And so we need to look at what the most logical boundary is for this gas certification system. The RSM we mentioned quite quickly, but there is in any qualifying contractual instrument design, it's important that we are accounting both explicitly for attributes and implicitly. So there are a number of examples where the residual supply mix will come into play, and effectively that will be the sum of all production types minus those production types that have had their attributes explicitly transferred. And that enables all energy users who are not actively participating in energy certification to understand also the attributes of their supply. This becomes more important as incoming gas types to the market differ from renewable, non-renewable, zero carbon, non-zero carbon, and also along any other attribute dimensions that do arise over time. The concept of bundled or unbundled certificate supply is an interesting one. Our proposal is that certificates are not required to be attached or bundled along with the underlying energy molecules, and that in fact the certificate can be sold anywhere within the same market boundary. This is logical and credible in our mind, provided that we are tracking all attributes implicitly and explicitly, and enables the producer of renewable gas to gain maximum benefit from that transaction, which ultimately we see as having the best chance of supporting more renewable production over time. System roles, pretty simply, we think it's important that parties are clearly characterised, registered, and understood within the roles of the constraints of the system. And so we have fundamentally the idea of a registrant, which is a producer, and the operator of a production device, and a participant, which is effectively someone engaged in the commercial activity around certificates, be it trading or sale of energy certificates. And they would ideally be the party responsible for a particular energy user. So the creation of these roles enables us to manage all interactions within the certification system with a high degree of oversight, while still making sure that the minimum number of parties are exposed to the higher levels of administration. That implies the use of a registry, which we have in place already in relation to the electricity certification system, and are committed to providing for gas certification as well. Fundamentally, the registry is the place where all the activity will formally take place. So the creation and maintenance of the accounts, the registered and participant accounts, the registration of the production devices, and the place where all information around that production is held. And therefore also that provides the basis for the issuance of certificates, transfer and redemption of those certificates against participating energy users. We see as a really key part of this the need to go through a process of verification of participating production devices. So any facility that wishes to be able to issue renewable gas certificates will need to have their site, their processes, their inputs reviewed in order for us to be able to verify that the information contained within their energy certificates is true and correct. I won't dwell too much on the transaction effectively, but it's key for us to enable issuance and transfer from one party to another, of course. We do that through a couple of key steps. One is the creation of a certificate, the issuance, and the other is the redemption against the energy user. It's important for us to recognise that there is a title being transferred from a seller to a buyer, and that once redeemed, that step effectively allocates that emissions unit to a particular energy user, and that's where it stays. Ian, did you want to talk about the next couple?
Yeah, sure. So units of measurement, obviously the certificates need to have a standard unit. And if you think about the gas industry, you'll find that bills for gas tend to be denominated in either kilowatt hours or gigajoules, and kilowatt hours is usually what you'll find on domestic bills, small commercial, and that sort of thing. The larger users tend to have their bills in gigajoules, if for no other reason than there'd be an awful lot of zeros if they were in kilowatt hours. But the thing is all of those units are completely interchangeable. I mean, a kilowatt hour, a megawatt hour, whatever, is just simply a measure of energy, and the joule is the SI unit for energy. So they are completely interchangeable. So it's more a matter of convenience than anything else. What's in the discussion paper as a proposal is that we use units of megawatt hours, which would make the gas certificates the same denomination effectively as the electricity equivalents. And a megawatt hour is, if you convert that, it's 3.6 gigajoules. But the question, I guess, is whether people who are gas users would find that confusing and would, prefer not to have to convert back and forth. So we're obviously interested in feedback on that. The next one, measurement of gas consumption. Obviously, holders of certificates will redeem those against their consumption, which obviously means you have to be able to measure their consumption accurately, in a timely fashion, and so on. And in particular, Tim mentioned earlier on about the processing of certificates needing to be time bound. Obviously, you can't go too long beyond the end of the gas year before you've got everything wrapped up. But the takeaway there is that obviously meters, particularly for large users, are measured either daily or at least monthly. And so the data is actually readily available and fits into the processing cycle that we will be proposing. So from that point of view, you don't have to worry about the fact that you've got a long tail with the downstream reconciliation rules and all of that sort of thing, because you do have the data that you need for individual gas users. Back to you, Tim.
Very good. And a couple of points really quickly around the attributes. It's a bit of a jargony term we use, but effectively any particular characteristic of the production can be classified as an attribute. So we talk about renewable, non-renewable, is something that we talk about a lot, of course. Any associated emissions, particular units around those emissions that were caused during the production process is another attribute. Really, any other dimension upon which a production device can be differentiated from others is a potential attribute. There's a bit of a trade-off between marketplace liquidity and attribute differentiation, but what we are fundamentally attempting to do here is enable production devices to seek sort of just reward for things they are doing that are better than others in the marketplace. And so there is the potential for other environmental co-benefits, social co-benefits, a range of other things. We've seen internationally that some of the attributes and labels that take hold within certificates might be whether a production facility has received any governmental funding or anything like that. All those things may have relevance to a buyer and so are possibly able to be included within a certificate. We foresee that this might develop over time and that there may be innovation on the production side over time as well, and that some parties may wish to see that innovation represented within the certificates. The final point is that we do see that the certificate is the place where all attributes are transferred. There is a risk of confusion once we start separating energy and certificates, and if you enable attributes to be transferred in multiple different streams, we see that the risk of that confusion becomes unacceptable.
Okay, so how are we going to apply this to the New Zealand gas industry? I should say that this slide is really mostly about gas that's being sold via the shared networks. So I'll just add some other stuff about sort of off-pipeline gas at the end. But the key thing is the gas that goes into the shared networks, by definition, has to be spec gas. It has to be to NZS 5442 standard. And that's a requirement of the interconnection agreement that you have with the pipeline owner. So it's not something that these rules will look to govern. It already exists. Similarly, the interconnection process, at least on the Maui pipeline, is a flow to nominations process, which means whoever is injecting the gas, whoever is selling the gas that is being injected, their purchasers will be nominating gas from that receipt point into the pipeline. And those shippers are deemed to get those nominations. So it's up to the producer to make sure that as much as possible, their production matches the nominated quantities that have been requested by their customers. The other thing that you need to know for interconnection is the characteristics of the gas entering the system, particularly the calorific value, because what we've got to keep straight here is it's not volumes of gas that we're tracking, but volumes of energy. And the issue there is that gas measurement systems measure volume, not energy. You have to convert using a whole bunch of mystic incantations, one of which is the calorific value. So you need to obviously take that into account. Timely delivery, that again goes back to being able to reconcile usage of certificates against production and consumption. And the last point, fungible commodity. Essentially what we're talking about there is that a shared system, you can't actually track those molecules, all right? So it's not possible for me sitting in Wellington to insist that, you know, the molecules injected somewhere in South Taranaki actually get to my gas meter. That's just a nonsense. But the fact is, a gigajoule of green gas is fundamentally the same as a gigajoule of natural gas. So if I have purchased, you know, X number of gigajoules of green gas, then either I'm using them or somebody else is. But the point is, the green gas that I have caused to come into the system is being consumed. And so it's fair enough for me to, in my carbon accounting, apply the certificate that I have got in respect of that green gas and say my usage is green. And it basically, it goes back to Tim's book and claim point on one of the earlier slides, that, you know, the benefit goes to whoever books and claims that renewable gas. Little thought experiment. Here's an example of essentially pipeline connected production and pipeline connected consumption. So you've got a scenario where a polytechnic wants to reduce its carbon footprint. It doesn't want to go the electrification route, as of course being an educational establishment, it's got no money. It can't produce enough biogas from its own waste, and would be keen to obtain biomethane from a third party. And there's a council-owned wastewater treatment plant which is currently capturing methane and flaring it, because obviously that's far preferable to letting the methane just go to atmosphere. But if it could sell certificates in order to help its cash flow, that would allow it to, you know, clean the gas up and inject it into the pipeline, and thereby displace some natural gas. So it looks like there, the Polytechnic and the council could potentially get together and cut a deal. And the question we're asking there is this okay? And it certainly looks to us like it's a perfectly reasonable proposition. You're getting green gas into the pipeline because somebody wants that for their own carbon accounting purposes. You're obviously having less fossil gas being combusted. So, all around that looks like a good thing. And if certification enables that to happen, then presumably that's a good thing as well. And there's another example here where we've got pipeline connected production, but consumption that's not pipeline connected. So here we've got an abattoir wanting to install a digester to process its organic waste. It'll use at least some of that gas on site for hot water, which abattoirs need quite a lot of. But it probably will produce more gas than it requires, and it figures it could inject that into a nearby pipeline. Except that the gas price alone doesn't make that viable. Then we have a poultry farm that would actually like to buy certificates to redeem against their LPG consumption. All right, so, and they're willing to pay enough for those certificates that would tip the balance for the abattoir being able to install the digestion unit and capture the gas. So the question is that okay? And I have to say, this is one that has been exercising our minds somewhat. And so have a think about that. I don't think we have got a definitive answer, but certainly interested in any comments that people might have on that. Alrighty. So one of the things we also need to think about in the design of a certification scheme is that there is potential opportunity for export of renewable energy via gas. All right, so the classic example of that would be, can you electrolyze water, produce hydrogen, compress it, ship it offshore somewhere? And without going into whether that is actually feasible, whether we have enough spare green electricity going to be able to do that, I think it's worth just thinking about what that means for the design of a certificate system. And what you obviously need is a high quality production certification. You need to absolutely assure that the hydrogen, say, is totally green. But you also need strong alignment between the New Zealand gas certification system and relevant international schemes, i.e. schemes where that hydrogen may be being received. So you need to align the methods and standards applied to certification, the sort of the format and content of the certificates. And you also need some ability to account for international transfers. So it doesn't immediately become obvious how you would do that, but obviously aligning the New Zealand scheme with what is going on overseas certainly paves the way to be able to support export if and when that ever happened. So the other thing we need to think about, Tim said earlier, you know, we're not going to get this absolutely right from day one, but also there may well be developments in the market that will also drive the need to change the rules. So the rules themselves need to contain an ongoing rule change ability. One of the things that is suggested in the consultation paper is the formation of a technical advisory committee, a group of industry and customer worthies who would be able to, I guess, help inject information into a process that would evaluate whether changes were needed and what sort of changes, because you don't want to change the rules and make them worse, obviously. We also see that consultation would be a part of the rule change process. It's always good to have extra eyes on things, and you know, consultation often flushes that out. And all of this obviously correlates with, you know, the assurance process that you need for a certification process.
We fully expect the system will develop over time. However, we do want to put in place some ability for participants to at least foreshadow the direction it might go. So these principles, again, we seek feedback on them, but we see these being key principles for the system now and into the future. First of all, the system is designed to support renewable gas. Renewable gas, amongst other things, is intended to enable organisations to decarbonise their operations. So the system should be geared towards having impact on net carbon emissions. It needs to be really reliable, it needs to be really accurate, and it needs to have all the relevant information baked into it. So great conversation here already around what information is relevant. Again, that can be expanded. Our mission in the first instance will be to make sure that we don't miss anything critical. And then if there are more informational aspects that are required, you know, we can go through the relevant process to include them in the certificates. Principle 3, again, in relation to Ian's point, both for organisations who are operating here in New Zealand and those who wish to potentially participate in export of renewable gases, it's really important that we are relevant and related to international standards. That's part of our role. We are independent fundamentally to any specific party in the New Zealand gas industry, and that's important to us again. And finally, that the system remain flexible and fit for purpose. So our intention now is to initiate a system for renewable gas certification so that the market is aware that that function is available. And then we fully expect that applications of certification will develop and that there may need to be associated development of the systems, rules, standards, etc., to make sure the principles, the elements, and conduct in the system are fully to the required standard.